everyone, Roxanne here from financerocks.com. Today I'm going to share 5 steps that I took to build my emergency fund from $200 to what I consider to be a full emergency fund, $10,000. This video is for you if you are maybe coming back around to the idea of needing to build up an emergency fund, or if you've never really sat down to think about it or plan it out. These are really the first 5 things I did, like I said, to get the ball rolling and to build that emergency fund and keep it. So let me tell you a little bit about what I consider to be my tipping point. It started my second summer in college. I was home alone in my apartment. I shared an apartment at the time with a friend of mine. I was at home and I decided to check my bank balance. I had been unemployed for a while. Before that, I was trying to sell knives unsuccessfully. Knew that I needed to check my account. It had been a while. I pulled it up. I only had $200 in my account. This was the lowest it had ever been since I went to college, and it really freaked me out. I didn't realize at the time that, $200 would be the point at which I decided enough is enough. I need to actually take action and actually get a job. It just turned out that that was the amount that shook me. I was shook. So I'll just overview quickly the 5 steps that I took. The first was to raise my standards. The second was to adopt a mindset that I was never going to spend the money that I was saving. The third was to get intentional about building a life where I had breathing room between my income and my expenses. The fourth was to begin a no-spend emergency savings mode. And the fifth was to start small and then build the emergency fund. So the first step was to raise my standards. So what do I mean by that? I decided that $200 in my bank account was not an acceptable amount for me to have. I decided that I never wanted to have as little as $200 ever again. That it wasn't what I had planned and it wasn't the life that I wanted to live. I think that a lot of people don't necessarily realize that they're in control of setting and keeping the standards for themselves. A lot of us set our standards when we're younger and maybe set them subconsciously and don't really realize it. I think a lot of people will actually set the same standards for themselves that their parents had for them. So I think that there, can be some cyclical nature to how we set these standards for our lives. So I believe that you get to set your own standards, and I believe that at any point you can decide to change your standards for your life. Now, I'm not talking about setting a goal for how much you want to have in your emergency fund. What I'm talking about is setting what is the bare minimum that you have to have for your life. It might seem like a small difference, but I think that this difference makes all the difference. We're all good intentioned. We would all like to have an emergency fund. Setting that I have to have this amount is different than saying I'd like to have this amount. So to define your new standards for yourself, you'll want to ask yourself this question. What is the bare minimum that I need to have in my account at all times? Now, I'm going to do a whole separate video about how to determine how much you should have in each emergency fund. I do like to separate it and have different purposes for different funds. But for now, I'll just say that it was about $1,000 was what I decided was my new bare minimum. I need to always have $1,000 worth of money, whether it be, in my savings account or in my checking account. I didn't really care where. I decided I needed to have $1,000 to prevent this kind of stress going forward. Step number 2 is to adopt the mindset that the money that you're setting aside right now is money that you will never spend. So I recommend starting with an emergency fund that I consider to be a death fund. This is kind of grim, you should be warned, but I take it very seriously. It's something that really matters to me to have this money. Now, this money serves 2 purposes. I would allow myself to spend it if it was the only money that I had, and if I don't buy food, I'll starve to death. The other reason that I keep this money is to cover my funeral expenses if I pass away so that my family doesn't have to be burdened by my end of life care and funeral costs. There is another reason that I like to call this, the death fund, which is that the money is dead to me. It's money that I don't even consider to really be real. It's not money that I'm going to spend on anything except for those scenarios, which hoping to avoid. So I plan to never spend it. Now, I know this is a little controversial. I know that not everybody believes that you should keep money that you never plan to spend. People will say, well, what's the point of making money if you're never going to spend it? And I understand wanting to be efficient with the money that you make and not, have to work so much harder than you need to in order, to survive. And I've even heard people say that their goal is to spend their last dollar on the day that they pass away. And I have to say, I can't relate to this mindset. Having been close to zero myself, I never want to be close to zero again at any age. As far away from zero as possible is my goal. Now, if I do end my life with money in the bank, then, I consider that money that I can give to family, leave a legacy essentially, or money that can go to charities that I care about. But I think that the mindset that you're going to spend all of your money prevents a lot of people from saving a proper emergency fund, from getting out of financial stress, and even from being able to build wealth that can sustain them in hard times. Now, setting this separate fund with this separate reason has also helped me to build the skill of setting aside money and not spending it. I do believe that it's a skill. I think it takes practice and it can take a while to kind of perfect that and get to the point where you're able to do it successfully. The other benefit that I found is just the discipline from not touching that money ever. And obviously, having the discipline to not spend money is going to help you to save your emergency fund and, like I said, build wealth and be able to leave a legacy to those that you care about. The third step that I took was to get intentional about building a life where my income is well above my expenses. I did finally get employment after my tipping point where I freaked out about not having enough money. Once I did, I really set out to make sure that the income that I would have would be enough to support the lifestyle that I wanted to have. At this time, I actually changed majors. I changed from psychology to accounting. Had done some research, and that was one of the upcoming careers that they thought there would be a lot of jobs for. So I wanted to make sure that the job that I had would be reliable and in demand and that I'd be able to get hired, having realized how crummy it is to not be working. And then I got really intentional about the expenses that I had. Would recommend focusing on the big three expenses. So for most people, bulk of their money goes to housing, transportation, and food. So if you can take care of those three things, even if you do nothing else as far as like cutting entertainment or the latte, the little latte, if you can get intentional about those three things, it's going to go a long way in your finances. So it's a little hard for me to just throw this out there and say, oh, well, you have to increase your savings rate and you have to make more money and spend less. Because it's kind of like, yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. But I did sit down and actually think about and add up what I wanted to be spending and look at what income would be required to have that level covered with a surplus. So having a gap in between income and expenses. And I've said before, savings rate is one of the most important statistics for your finances. It does tie in with this intentionality. I didn't have a lot of fixed expenses at this time. In fact, I was only spending about $230 a month for my rent and utilities. If I didn't drive my car, I didn't really have transportation costs. I got serious with how much I was spending on food, which I'm going to go into next. Really, for me at this time, my focus was on income. Up until this point, I had always been a good saver and I had that part of it covered. but it was the income where I was lacking. It was that anxiety about getting hired, and being unemployed and not forcing myself to take action had contributed to the problem. Really looking at both sides of that and determining where your strength is and where your weakness is of those two, and then tackling them head on to figure out, how can I improve this situation and make sure this does not happen again. Step number four. Step number four was when I decided that I was going to go into a no spend emergency savings mode. Now, this can look different for you, and I do recommend that you customize this to your level of not only situation, but comfort level. I was kind of extreme because I was freaked out at the time and wanted to see a lot of progress quickly. So I definitely went with a more extreme approach. Decided what I was willing to spend money on as I went from $200 to $1,000, and what I was not going to spend money on during this time as well. And I was very specific with it. I decided I was going to cut out things like haircuts, any recreation, entertainment, time with friends, time with family. I decided that I was only going to spend on necessary transportation, so no driving my car, which means I walked to work. I even skipped Thanksgiving with my family that year, which all I would have had to do was drive home, but decided to stay home for that. I decided to cut food down to essentially like bare minimum food spending. So it was like bananas, potatoes, and rice. I went pretty hardcore with the food aspect of this. And since I already was paying very little in rent, I didn't make any changes to any of my fixed costs. Had I had like streaming services at the time, I would have canceled them. Had I had gym membership at the time, I would have canceled it. This was basically me saying only needs, no wants. And I do not regret this time where I decided to prioritize my finances. It was important for me to get this right, and I really valued that and wanted to do it. For that reason, it didn't really seem like that much of a sacrifice to say no for a few months to my friends and family while I was able to get this under control, get that $1,000 built up, and be able to kind of breathe that sigh of relief that comes from building up that emergency fund. I wanted to caution you guys because if you go really hardcore with cutting expenses for too long of a time frame, it can really cause you to feel deprived, which can lead to yo-yo spending or binge spending. So just like with food, if you deprive yourself on a diet for too long, you're likely to see an increase in unhealthy eating afterwards because, it's been exhausting emotionally to keep up with that routine. And I have seen the same thing happen in my finances. So I did little sprints. Like I would go into emergency savings mode and then I would take a little breather. And now it was still reasonable spending, but, I would loosen the restrictions on food and time with people, transportation briefly. And then I would go into another hardcore savings mode to get the gears turning and to get that done quickly. Step number 5 was to start small and then grow it bigger. So like I said, I set my $1,000 standard as far as this is what I have to have. If I have more than that, great, I'm going to try to, but I have to have 1,000. As soon as I hit that mark, a couple months after starting, I realized I need to have more than $1,000 to always have $1,000. Now, at this time, I was just storing the $1,000 emergency fund in my checking account to prevent from bouncing any checks because I'm older. So I just had it in my checking account. I realized right away I needed to have above and beyond that, 1 month of expenses, and, started adding up what it would take to maintain this $1,000. So what I did then was to set myself the goal of a $2,000 emergency fund. So theoretically, that would be the $1,000 of death fund, plus money on top of that for current expenses that I could actually spend. And then I went on to build that in $1,000 increments for other types of emergencies that might come up. Things like my car dying. Certainly that is something that happens. Cars do die. So I wanted to have money set aside for that kind of scenario where I could actually spend the money. I didn't have the same restrictions on those types of emergency funds, but I started saving those other ones. So I would recommend, don't go from having $0 or $200 emergency fund to expecting yourself to have like a $50,000 emergency fund. I found that once I hit that 1,000, I started to have some momentum in my finances. Like I said, I had kind of set myself up to have that gap between income and expenses. So then I was able to save quickly, and I hit 2,000 and I said, okay, I'm always going to have 3,000. I increased my standard again. So then I said 3,000. I kept increasing it $1,000 at a time. That helped me have like little wins along the way. It helped keep me going and motivated towards building emergency funds until I got to the point where I actually had the $10,000 emergency fund. And what I realized after going with that $10,000 emergency fund for a while was that for me, it was unlikely that I was going to have expenses come up that would deplete that $10,000. So that was where I kind of settled down and I said, okay, I don't really need more than this. This is going to cover most, if not all, of the scenarios that I would face. And I did go into emergency saving mode up until the point where I would hit that number and then I would, pause and then decide to increase it again. So, like I said, with the emergency savings mode is that you can activate that when you need it and, to accelerate your progress and make sure that you're hitting those targets that you want and need to hit. So a few things that you might want to know about my finances at this time that kind of explain how I settled on that number. One, I did not have health insurance over most of this time frame, so maybe I needed more in emergency funds because of that. Another thing, I did not have kids or any dependents at this time, and I did not own a home. I think those are other reasons why you might consider having more in an emergency fund, or why you might find yourself needing more than that for whatever kind of emergencies might come up. I will do another video talking about how to determine how much you should have in emergency funds, but I just wanted to mention that those were my circumstances at the time. In my experience, having this emergency fund has really been the antidote for financial stress. Financial stress was something that has plagued me my whole life when I was growing up, and it's something that I strive to get away from in my own finances. I think that a lot of people think that they're going to need so much money to feel secure in their finances. I've heard people say that they need $1 million before, they'll be satisfied. And I didn't find that to be the case. I suspect that a lot of people, if they had the $10,000 emergency fund, for example, would actually feel the sense of security that they are looking for, the kind of peace of mind that helps you to sleep at night. It's the breathing room of, I don't have to worry about losing my job and not having income, and I'll be fine. I know that this money that I have is going to last me for X number of months, so I don't have to stress out when things come up. And actually, the whole reason that I started coaching and started writing the blog and doing the YouTube channel was because I had talked to a lady at work, a coworker of mine, who didn't have $600 to fly to the East Coast to visit her mom who was terminally ill and about to pass away. And I hope these, oh. So I hope these tips help you to start taking steps to build your emergency fund and to find what works for you and to be able to add a layer of financial security to your life. And until next time, I hope your emergency funds rock. Thank you. The third step that I took was getting intentional. Oh, the third step I took was getting intentional. I don't think that's a word. Being intentional. Intentional.